Absolutely brilliant. And I guess the next thing I'd be wondering is, please describe the many functions of IMUNO.
Well, IMUNO, again, is a supplement, but it is unique among supplements for a variety of reasons. First of all, its molecular structure. As I said, oil-water emulsions, or in scientific jargon, hydrophilic, hydrophobic emulsions, have a number of effects. IMUNO is modeled upon the early protocells, the first forms of proto-life that appeared on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago. So it is sort of a self-assembly where the core is this low molecular weight, non-animal derived chondroitin sulfate, a glycosaminoglycan. And this ultra-pure, homogeneous, low molecular weight chondroitin sulfate is inherently nano-sized. It comes in nanometers, so you don't need to nano-size it, it is already nano-sized. Now, around this core, you have a bilayer, that is 2 layers of ultra-pure phosphatidylcholine. Now, this molecule, they self-assemble. So you don't need to tell them how to interact with each other, because they do this automatically. And this type of self-assembly is what is thought today and for many years, to be at the origin of life, following a principle that is called negentropy. Negentropy means negative entropy. It was Erwin Schrödinger, a physicist, who in 1944, during World War II, wrote a book, What is Life? And he first talked about this self-assembly of molecules in the context of negative entropy. And vitamin D3 is intercalated in this structure. So, first of all, the molecular structure is unique. Secondly, because of the small size of its components, low molecular weight, chondroitin sulfate, and of course, phosphatidylcholine, that is a single phospholipid, it spontaneously forms nanoliposomes. So I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of liposomes that are excellent delivery systems to deliver a number of supplements and drugs. Take, for example, vitamin C as an example. These liposomes, self-assembled liposomes, are in the nanometer range, so are nanoliposomes. And so you have nanoliposomes without the need of doing anything. So you don't need to use ultrasounds as you usually do when you want to make liposomes for vitamin C, for example, or other technicalities. We could say again that it is the most primeval form of biological organization. And since all biological reactions depend on a surface phenomena, and the molecules, they react and recognize each other at the level of their surfaces. Surface biochemistry is essential in all biochemical processes. So because of this, and because you are working at the level of nanometers, you have an enormous efficiency, because just a little quantity of IMUNO exerts great effects at the biological level, because it is nano-sized and it is nanoliposomes. And again, it is a spontaneously nano-sized. You don't need to do anything. It's a self-assembly. Now, it is important that not only it is nano-sized, but it is also liposomal. So you have a sort of a nanoliposomes. Why it is important? Because, for example, when we talk about vitamin D3 has a huge number of effects, but also it has some side effects, like, for example, hypercalcemia. So if you take too much vitamin D3, you end up with too much calcium in your blood, with a number of unpleasant consequences. But it is known that if you put vitamin D3 into liposomes, you significantly reduce the hypercalcemia. So in our case, everything is done without us telling the molecules what to do. because in our case, in the case of IMUNO, vitamin D3, it is naturally inside liposomes that are in nanometer range. And because of these peculiarities, it works on different levels. First of all, it works because its components, chondroitin sulfate, phosphatidylcholine, and vitamin D3, they have known biological effects, known healthy effects. They have been on the market as supplements for decades, and everybody knows that vitamin D3 or chondroitin sulfate or phosphatidylcholine have a number of effects. What is the novelty? Where is the difference? In IMUNO, because they are organized in such a unique molecular structure, their effects are amplified. And also because they are nano-sized and they are organized as liposomes. So this favors bioavailability and cellular molecular interaction. So you need a very low dose. Now, what are the known activities of each one of the components? Very many. I'll try to summarize. Chondroitin sulfate has a number of known effects. For example, it is known that it has anti-inflammatory properties. As a matter of fact, it is used in the context of rheumatoid arthritis. And it has effects on wound healing, and it has immunostimulating and anti-cancer properties that are known since the 60s of the last century. It was Dr. Pruden from New York Hospital who described these immunostimulating or immuno-augmenting, as he called them, activities and anti-cancer effects of a very primitive bovine cartilage extract. It also has neuroprotective effects. That is, it is very useful in neurodevelopmental and neurodegenerative conditions. What about phosphatidylcholine? Reduces inflammation, enhances the cognitive function, shows positive effects on mood, daily functioning, cognition of elderly patients with Alzheimer's disease or dementia. So it has a number of effects that again are amplified by its molecular assembly in IMUNO. And vitamin D3, you know, it's a very complex hormone. It is much more than a vitamin. It's a hormone that is involved not only in calcium homeostasis, but also in the integrity of the immune system. Vitamin D deficiency, as you know, is linked not only to rickets, but also to inflammatory and long latency diseases such as multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, again, inflammatory conditions, tuberculosis, diabetes, and various types of cancer. Now, up to the point that in 2008, authors from the Medical University of South Carolina wrote a paper entitled, "Does vitamin D make the world go round?" So it was a kind of a rhetorical question, and just to show how important is vitamin D in the well-being, in the homeostasis of our body. Then there is, in addition to these, I would say, mainstream or classical effects, there is the epigenetic level. Now, because we have nanoliposomes containing low molecular weight, chondroitin sulfate, and vitamin D3, now you have molecules that can penetrate inside the cells. So because of this configuration, the low molecular weight chondroitin sulfate and the vitamin D3 can enter into the cells and can interact with DNA. Now, this becomes complicated, and I hope that it is not too boring, but the interaction of chondroitin sulfate with the DNA leads to results similar, if not identical, to those of a class of drugs that are called histone deacetylase inhibitors. Now, these are compounds that have proven useful in cancer. For example, one of these is called vorinostat, and it's very useful in a number of different cancers, in psychiatric and neurological diseases, in chronic inflammatory diseases, and so on. So essentially, IMUNO, by penetrating into the cells and by having the chondroitin sulfate bound to DNA, exerts effects comparable to those of histone deacetylase inhibitors that again are very, very effective drugs. Now, because of this, this interaction with DNA normalizes gene expression. Now, this leads to some slippery slope because normalizing gene expression leads to the concept of adaptogens. I don't know if you're familiar with adaptogens, but it is a term that has had a lot of attention. Now, the concept of adaptogens was originally created in 1947, so many years ago, to describe a substance, originally some herbal preparations, botanicals, that may increase resistance to stress. And adaptogenesis was later applied in the former Soviet Union to describe remedies, natural remedies, thought to increase the resistance of organisms to biological stress by essentially rebalancing the homeostasis of organisms. Another definition for an herb to be considered an adaptogen requires that it must be non-toxic, non-specific, and it has, of course, to affect the physiology of the organism, and so IMUNO responds to all these requirements. Problem is that most of the studies conducted on adaptogens were performed in the former Soviet Union, Korea, and China before the 1980s. And in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration issued a warning recently in 2013 discouraging the use of this word because they say there is not sufficient scientific information behind. For example, there was a company based in Washington and they advertised something as an adaptogen and the FDA said, no, you can do this, whatever the case. So whether you want to use the word adaptogen or not, there is no doubt that by regulating gene expression, as IMUNO does, as histone deacetylase inhibitors like vorinostat do, you definitely rebalance the expression of genes, so you rebalance the working of DNA. Another mechanism of action is the role of as an adjuvant. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing this known correctly or not. It comes from the Latin adjuvare, which means to help. Now, adjuvants are molecules that are designed to help boost the immune response, in particular when you are given a vaccine. And in 1998, Yamamoto thought exactly that GcMAF was working as an adjuvant. But there is something a little bit curious or mysterious. Now, as you know, vaccines are given in billions of doses to humans and animals with undisputable efficacy. So for the moment, we don't enter into the controversy about vaccines at certain age in humans. But vaccination works, on this there is no doubt. But vaccination works because of adjuvants. And the mechanism of action of adjuvants in vaccination remains what a recent paper called Immunologist's Little Dirty Secret. Because essentially, nobody knows very, very well why you need an adjuvant, which is a rather brute substance, like a water-oil emulsion, to boost an immune response. Shouldn't the antigen be enough to teach the cells of the immune system to fight against a virus or a bacteria or something else? No, they are not. Because in order to activate a T and B lymphocytes, so to have effective immunization, if you do without adjuvants, no matter how ultra pure the antigen is, no matter how ultra pure the vaccine is, you do not achieve effective immunization. So you need these things. And IMUNO was designed to be sort of an universal adjuvant. So it helps to boost the immune response by itself, but also it helps to boost immune responses when you want to go another route. For example, and maybe we can talk about this later, for example, when you want to employ vaccines against cancer or vaccines against Alzheimer's disease, so the so-called therapeutic vaccines. In that case, something like IMUNO might definitely boost the immune response. And then there are two other mechanisms of action that are a little bit more exotic. The so-called non-chemical DNA signaling. Until now, we have talked about IMUNO, considering it just like a kind of a peculiar, kind of innovative, but still a molecule that interacts with other molecules. So in your mind, you can think that the chondroitin sulfate goes and binds to DNA, vitamin D3 goes and binds to its receptor, and then binds to DNA, and so on. So classical biochemistry, classical chemistry, biochemistry, recognition between two different surfaces, and so on. But there is something more. Think that chondroitin sulfate is a highly charged molecule. So it has a very dense concentration of negatively charged groups because of the sulfate groups and the carboxylic acid. So think of it like the negative pole of a battery. So a number of negative charges on the surface of chondroitin sulfate. Phosphatidylcholine, on the contrary, has positive charges on its head, the choline. So you have positive charges, so the other pole of a battery. So here you have a complex of positively and negatively charged molecules put together, just as if you have a battery with two poles, negative and positive. Point is that chondroitin sulfate and phosphatidylcholine assembled in these protocellular structures that we first observed in 1985, as I said before. Now, they are in our bloodstream, and they are propelled at speeds varying from 40 centimeters per second in the aorta, just after the heart has pumped the blood, down to 0.03 centimeter per second in capillaries. So they have a positive and negative acceleration. So they accelerate first and they brake then. And every time that an electrical charge is accelerated, whether positively or negatively, so whether it accelerates or decelerates, there is a generation of an electromagnetic field. Now, electromagnetic field of these types, of course, are variable because the speed varies, and are individual because the speed of your blood is different from mine, whether you're exercising or not, whether you have atherosclerotic plaques or not, whether your arteries are tortuous or are straight, whatever. So it's very, very individual. So this radio signal that is associated, because it's nothing else, a varying electromagnetic field is a radio signal that is generated by the molecules of IMUNO every time they're pumped out from the heart. These radio signals, they interact with DNA. Now you may think, how can they interact with DNA? Is DNA an antenna that is able to receive radio signals just like your radio? And the answer is yes, absolutely so. And actually, Dr. Stefano Atterini and myself, in the Encyclopedia on Cancer and in many other papers, we described how DNA works like a fractal antenna. So it is just like the antenna. It's a very, very long molecule. So it's a very long molecule, very long antenna. We have about 2 meters of DNA in each cell of our body. So think how long it is and how many kilometers or miles of DNA we have in our bodies. So DNA works as a fractal antenna, able to send and receive signals under the form of radio waves. Now, the radio waves, or varying or variable electromagnetic fields generated by IMUNO in our blood, and because they are reminiscent of the organization of protocells in our body, they are supposed to reset the functioning of DNA. Just like you reset your computer when you have downloaded too many viruses or you have made too many mistakes, so you're able to reset your computer. We think that these radio signals generated by the flow of IMUNO in our blood is able to reset the functioning of DNA. Now, this is very important when DNA doesn't produce the right communication, like in cancer, for example, or in autism, or in neurodegenerative diseases. That's where my curiosity about communication in cells came to help. So cells don't communicate uniquely through hormones or neurotransmitters or molecules, they also communicate with each other through radio signals. And we think that IMUNO is able to restore or to reset the original radio signal. And then the last one is the so-called level of the biological quantum entanglement, what Einstein described, who never accepted so much this phenomenon, described it as a spooky action at a distance. Now, we know today that the quantum entanglement, of course, is not only limited to the realm of physics, but it is very well present in biological processes. So we know that it is involved, and probably it is at the basis of human consciousness, thanks to the work of Professor Stu Ameroff at the University of Arizona in Tucson, not too far from here. We often see each other, and it's always enriching to speak with him. So we know biological quantum entanglement in human consciousness. Bird navigation, birds could not find their ways in the sky if not for biological quantum entanglement. Photochemical reactions like photosynthesis and gene expression, that is what it is of our interest. Now, all living beings somehow are entangled because we all derive from the primitive ancestors whose appearance on Earth as primitive, primeval protocells dates back to about 3.5, 3.8 billion years ago. So we are all entangled. This concept has been widely described not only by biologists, but also by philosophers like Deleuze and Guattari, French philosophers who in the 70s proposed this idea of a rhizome that is sort of a root that encompasses all forms of living beings of today and yesterday and probably of the future on Earth. And I published a paper how this concept relates to immortality in 2017. So IMUNO, by resembling the primitive protocells, is able to send a signal through quantum entanglement that again resets or brings to equilibrium the functioning of not only DNA, but probably other structures as well. I know I've been rambling around complex concepts, so please feel free to ask for any clarification you may need.